welcome back to Green Thread.
Hi.
It's your host, Allie,
And Alexis.
and we are yet again joined by a special guest. Want to say hello?
Yeah, hello. This is Brandy Rogers coming at you
Reporting,
again
reporting to you
from the
live.
woods.
Yeah, no, literally, we're in the middle of the woods right now. Guys, did y'all know that in 2021, there was a survey that showed that nearly 60% of respondents between 16 and 25 years old were extremely worried about climate change?
Oh,
No, I hadn't heard that.
what year was that?
In 2021.
Oh,
So
okay.
it's pretty recent, but
Yeah.
there's been more since. They just kind of are splitting them up into demographics of age groups. That's why I included this one because it seemed to be like a lot of younger people are starting to get
Yeah,
kind of worried.
Very
But
worried. The majority.
exactly, the ones that are gonna make a good change, I think. But that's kind of our intro to today's topic, which is climate anxiety. So when we one of I think it was legit our first episode
Yeah.
ever, we briefly talked about climate anxiety and just how important it is. And it was right before the election, so we were honestly in that what's
don't
gonna
know.
happen? Yeah. So now we
Yeah.
know. We've been in it for over 100 days now, which is insane. But this is kind of our follow up, and we have a special guest to kind of talk about more of a external, point of view, and also we are in complete different age groups too, so it can kind of give you a different perspective than just us. Because I assume that everybody has a different way of showing their emotions and dealing with them. We kind of briefly talked about that before we started recording. But just to go into that, I wanted to ask you specifically, put you on the
Okay.
spot here.
Okay.
What are some of the most concerning trends that you have heard of or seen of that could maybe contribute to feelings of anxiety?
Oh gosh, there are so many, right? We
Yeah.
all hear them.
Oh, yeah.
I I mean, we can name off the stats, right? We can talk about
Yeah.
melting sea ice, we can talk about rising temperatures, we can talk about deforestation. That's not really the trend that concerns me the most. The trend that concerns me the most at this juncture is without jumping directly into politics, the attack on science, right?
Yeah.
And just the skepticism. And climate science in particular has been subject to a lot of skepticism over the years for various reasons. Um, but I think in general, there's sort of a strange shift towards where people are more suspicious
Mm-hmm.
maybe of science as a discipline in general,
Mhm.
right? And, and
Yeah.
and suspicious of the information. And I think that's probably the more disturbing trend to me, because all the other trends have been disturbing and will continue to be. The actual climate data, that stuff is freaky and it's real and we hear it. And the other part I think that is the most disturbing to me is that we have surpassed some
Yeah.
milestones that
Yes.
that were discussed 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. Okay, well, by this date we need to have this done, or XYZ.
Mm-hmm.
And they're all just prognoses. We can't say for sure what's going to happen, but some of those benchmarks have come and gone, and I
Mhm.
think that is
Yeah.
that can feed into the feelings of anxiety and fear, honestly, right? And hopelessness, thinking like, well, now it's too late. So I
Absolutely.
think those are, and I don't know how much of that is really going to play out the way that
Mhm.
are using. We use models and science to predict these things, and I'm not saying, oh, we have no idea what's going to happen, but yeah, it's just, I think that's kind of disturbing.
Yeah, I also think that a lot of the times that I hear about things that have surpassed a due date or, expected date have to do with animals. And that's the ones that it's a little tricky in my mind of, nature always bounces back. We've kind of briefly talked about that in previous episodes, but you know, sometimes I think it's harder for organisms that are not used to the environment that's, happening now to bounce back. So it's just
Sure.
people think about that and get a little upset because, that's kind of out of our control at that point.
Yeah.
To an extent, there's some things that we can definitely not do, like habitat fragmentation and all these other things. But that's one of the main things I think of when you were talking about things that are already gone or might not be able to come back is mostly animals for some reason.
Yeah. Well, I think animals are unique in some ways in terms of climate issues, right? Because
Yeah.
you have animals have abilities to shift with environmental change, right? To adapt. Maybe you can move, right? You're ambulatory if you're an animal, right? So you can just get up and go somewhere else. But maybe there's a highway in your way, or maybe it's outside of the range of conditions that you can function in, right?
Right.
So I think the thing with animals and plants too, I mean, just organisms evolve slowly and adapt slowly.
Mhm.
And the climate is changing faster than they can biologically adapt to those changes. And so when those changes happen, when those organisms are gone, they're gone. So there's one thing to say the earth is resilient and it can always recover and it can will always bounce back. Life finds a way. It sure does, right? But it's not going to look the same as it does now. If you lose something, it can't bounce back. You
Yeah.
get to a point where there are so few of a particular organism left that you enter into an extinction vortex and there's no bouncing back from that. You don't have the genetic diversity that you need or, habitat or whatever. And so I think that is not true. I think I've heard a lot of like, oh, well, the planet will be fine. Things will bounce back. Or the other thing that I hear, going back to your earlier question about things that are disturbing, I have had conversations with individuals that have said things like, well, scientists will figure out a solution. Don't worry about it because like as if there is like a magic
Right,
bullet, right?
right.
And I think sometimes there is. Oh, there's a vaccine for this, or we're not going to use CFCs anymore. We're going to heal the ozone layer. Sometimes there is a straightforward answer to a problem. This is not one of those, right? And so when people are sort of at the same time, they're looking to science to solve the problem, but they're also scoffing at science
Yes.
along the way and
Yes.
saying, well, there's not really a problem to solve anyway. And so it's a little
Yes,
bit of a
it's a
strange
it's a weird
dichotomy.
loophole,
Yes.
and I think that a lot of the skepticism and the attack on science, as we were speaking of earlier, comes from thinking that we have all the knowledge at our fingertips with technology, computers, phones. Like,
Yeah.
okay, I'll just Google this or whatever.
Yeah.
But the first answer that pops up on Google, now the AI overview that pops up on Google, is
Yeah.
not always right and has not always fully answered the question. And as I've discovered in studies and just doing research as a student, most of the time, once you have that first question, that's not going to answer it. That's too broad. You got to go deeper and
Yeah.
deeper and deeper, or ask a different question, or just ask a different version of the question
Right.
to really get the answer. And I think that people don't realize how much they don't know because we have relied a lot on technology, which is fun. I mean, technology is great. I'm not dissing technology, but I'm just saying that people think they know a lot more than they do.
That is very true
Mhm.
in many circumstances.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Uh-huh.
Or if like you were saying, if it's not like straightforward like AI, then they kind of get a little questionable of like what answer is it? That like it's almost like they're not. I don't want to say they're lazy, but it's like they're not interested enough to learn further, but they still want the answer. So
Sure. It's like the easy answer is satisfying enough to like
Mhm.
yeah,
quelch your curiosity and then
Mhm.
you can say, oh, okay, I know about that now. I can
Mhm.
go on. So yeah,
right.
I think that's partially because it's easy and partially because people are busy and they're,
Mhm.
Yeah.
so can't blame them for all that,
No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I know it
It's
is
like hazards of outdoor. What did you call it?
living
Living
classroom.
classroom.
Living
Yeah.
I love that.
classroom.
But the bugs are here, so
Yeah, I know.
They're living here too.
they are.
So I was also gonna touch on different environmental changes and how they occur naturally versus with climate change, and how could that feed into climate anxiety when thinking about the way it would function naturally versus how we've kind of sped things up or changed them.
Yeah, I think that first of all, it is very important that people understand that. So I'm
Mhm.
glad that you asked that question in that way, that there are natural fluctuations that we would expect to see in temperature and
Mhm.
carbon dioxide levels. And if you go back through time and you pull ice cores or whatever things
Mhm.
you're using to get this type of data, we know that there have been historical highs and
Right.
historical lows
Mhm.
with both carbon dioxide and temperature, and
Mhm.
it's causation. That, we
Right.
can see that. We know that it goes together, and the problem where the anxiety comes in is very much like human population growth, which
Mhm.
is exponential. Um, Emissions, fossil fuel emissions,
Yeah.
have also increased exponentially, and so has the temperature that goes along with it, right? And so what we see when we look at these graphs of historical data for CO2 and for temperature, they have an up down sort of a wave pattern.
Mhm.
There's a historical max, like I said, and a min, and they sort of stay within that area
Mhm.
until you hit the Industrial Revolution.
Mhm.
And then you go up back to that peak, that historical peak, and then you blow past it.
Mhm.
Right.
And you just shoot straight up that graph in a straight line. So
Mhm.
it's almost like it's not even exponential anymore.
Yeah.
It's just straight up the sky.
Yeah.
And I think that feeds into it because if you do know that, then it's harder to say these are natural fluctuations, right? It's harder to say, oh, this has happened before. You know, we've had ice ages and we've had warm times, you know, thermal maxima and things like that. This is just part of it. But when you do realize that we are actually contributing to it, there is an anthropomorphic or anthropogenic, component to it, that I think that does dial up the anxiety, because there's no really denying that what we've had to do with this. So I think that it does add to the anxiety, but you have to know, right? Because if you don't know what the problem is, you don't know where to start. And so you can hide your head in the sand because it makes you anxious, or you can use your anxiety as fuel for learning more and taking some kind of action, whatever that looks like for you. So
Yeah, I know. Whenever I talk to like my not even colleagues, but just like friends, or just like it comes up in a casual conversation, we always talk about like where those first signs were, or like what we kind of not even have an argument, but more just kind of a discussion of like what caused that massive spike, or like where did we first see that the numbers kind of reflected the like our feelings, because now we can definitely directly feel like the causation of that, of like, you know, seasons are changing, temperature, like it's hot one day, cold one day, like it's all over the place now. And I feel like even people that are denying it now are a little bit like, you know, behind times, because you walk outside and
I mean, wildfires and hurricanes
exactly,
and things like that. You really can't
exactly,
deny it.
exactly.
If
But
it's
they
staring you in the face.
yeah, and it's just like, you know, why I don't I just I guess I, as a scientist but also just like as a person, kind of get confused when people don't understand that, you know, we have had a direct impact on it. And like to see that, you know, when you look at those graphs, you can dumb it down to just, you know, when this started and when it ended, and it shows you flat out just based on research and, you know, the statistics that we've gathered from the atmosphere and from you know, just anywhere that we get that climate data from. But they still are like, you know, what this would have happened either way. And I'm like, and maybe, but not at the rate, and at the rate that it would have done naturally. I feel like, you know, the environment would have been able to like heal itself.
Right. It
'Cause
self-regulates. Yeah.
exactly. And we saw that in COVID, because I feel like that, I know you had mentioned previously about like if we weren't here, the earth would just kind of sigh like in relief.
Yeah.
And it kind of did that already. And we
yeah.
saw. And so it's like, see what happens when you
Oh,
don't
wow.
go everywhere in a car?
What an
Or
interesting time to live through as a person and watch that happen, right?
Yep.
And it was like it didn't take long.
Mm-mm.
So
No.
it starts to make you think, oh, maybe we wouldn't have to make all the drastic
Right.
maybe little changes do add up. And I don't know, that was pretty drastic. Everybody stayed home, but for a short
Still,
period of time
yeah.
before you see some resilience. So
Still, and that honestly was both. It was a win-win for people though, because then I think, even though, oh, maybe for some people it caused a lot of like mental problems. I mean, I myself know that my anxiety was pretty high during that period of time, but also that kind of pushed people to get outside and, you know, do
absolutely.
things that weren't their normal activity, and in turn helped them heal through that time. So
Yeah. Do you know how many more people have started going outside?
Oh,
yeah,
yes, the
numbers,
statistics are
yeah, when you can
amazing.
look at like national park attendance and things like
right.
that, and like how many more people are buying things like kayaks or snow skis or whatever,
Yes.
because people just went outside, which is
Yeah.
great because it is good for your mental health. And hey, that's a really good way to fight anxiety.
And we
right?
have talked about that,
Yeah.
about how, you
Yeah.
know, being outside does aid your mental health.
Yeah.
I also think that, kind of going off of what I was just saying of like me as a scientist, but also as a person, like I get confused. Do you think that the understanding that we have of ecological principles would kind of help with coping our specific climate anxiety, or like would is that the missing piece in other people's understanding of what's going on, is just understanding how it happens, or like why, like I don't know. I don't, maybe that's a confusing question, but
I think it's a nuanced question. I think there's a lot there. Um, I think that understanding the ecological principles that sort of underpin why we're concerned about climate change
yeah.
makes it worse. And I had to say that first.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it also helps. Knowledge is power, right? And so and ignorance is indeed bliss. I would say
Yep.
that both of those cliches are true to some extent. You have to understand the concepts in order to understand the problem.
Right.
I think that that's really important. I think just basic understanding of what is the cause. Why does carbon dioxide matter? You know, because I think sometimes we miss that. And maybe if you don't understand how the whole system is working together and why emissions lead to global climate changes, and not just global warming, right?
Yeah.
Because that's a huge misconception. It's the severe weather, and it's the
Mhm.
droughts, and it's the fires, and the things like that. So, but on the other hand, if you understand ecologically what's happening, what's going on, right? The things that are changing, species that we're losing forever, or the possible impacts, right, of
Mhm.
these types of changes. You it's, I don't know, it's a blessing and a curse. That's what I'm trying to
Yes.
say.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have to understand it, because if you don't understand it, then you can't fix it. But then when you
Mhm.
do understand it, it can become disheartening because you can see the damage. Does that
Yes.
make sense?
Absolutely.
So it's like, I want to know, but I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to see it. I want to be aware of it. I want to be able to speak to, the changes that need
Right.
to happen. But at the same time, it's like, it can be very frustrating because you see where it's headed.
Mhm.
Right.
If nothing changes. So
Or it's like you do know and you don't want to know.
right,
Yeah.
right, absolutely. Is that kind of what you were getting at with that
Yeah,
question?
no,
Okay.
absolutely, yeah.
Well, and I think a lot of fear comes from not knowing something. Like
Yeah.
when people are afraid of spiders or snakes or,
Yeah,
whatever. And
absolutely.
anything in any example, it's just because you don't know what it does. I don't know if that snake's going to bite me. I don't know if that
Mhm.
spider is going to bite me. I don't know if it's poisonous. I don't know. So I'm
Yeah.
just going to be scared. But
Yes.
if you figure out, oh, this snake doesn't even have teeth, whatever,
Yes.
whatever the situation may
Oh
be.
my gosh, I had a great story about that.
Oh,
So
yeah.
we were sitting, my husband and I were sitting at a high school football game.
Oh,
'Cause
no.
our girls did color guard.
Mm-hmm.
So we're sitting there watching a football game, and a moth, like a really giant, cool looking moth, lands on his back. And he didn't feel it because it's a moth.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I'm just sitting there next to him, and these two teenage girls are sitting behind us, and one of them leans up and she doesn't tap him, and she taps me on the shoulder, and she's like, "Ma'am, there's a giant bug on his back." And I was like, "Oh." So I turned and looked, and I was like, "Oh, okay. It's just a
Yeah.
moth." And they looked at me like I had two heads, because I was not concerned that there was a moth. And they looked at me, and they looked at each other, and they got up and they left. And I thought that was the most extreme reaction, first of all, that they were terrified of this moth, to the point where when they warned me about the moth and I didn't react, they moved, because I think they thought that we were not, we were crazy.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's a moth. But if I don't know what a moth is, and I don't know that moths don't
Don't bite or sting
have
or
mouth
hurt.
parts to
Right,
bite
yeah.
you with, then maybe it's scary,
Yeah.
right? So yeah, absolutely, it feeds into what you're talking about. And then yeah, you are afraid of what you don't know. So,
Exactly.
Right.
yeah.
Absolutely. And what would you say from your perspective? What are your kind of concerns with the climate crisis right now? Like specifically, or just what are concerns that you've seen that you're like, oh, okay, yeah, that's something we should be concerned about?
I think it's not, again, it's not the data, right?
Mhm.
It's not the specific things like, I'm very worried about the polar bears. Yes, but
Yeah.
it is the larger scale,
Mm-hmm.
right? My concerns are that we won't do what we need to do in time.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I don't worry about my own lifetime necessarily. I think we'll continue to see changes, and I think we'll continue to see rapid changes. But I am more concerned about humans in the future,
Mm-hmm.
because, like we've said, the planet will be fine.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
and humans may be fine, but not in the way that we are fine now.
Mhm.
We're already seeing populations that are suffering, and
Right.
in unjustly, right?
Mhm.
You're right.
Unproportionally. That's not the word I'm looking for, but
Yep.
disproportionately. Lower income
Mm-hmm.
Right.
women, children.
Exactly.
These are the populations that are suffering the most from things like sea level rise, and hurricane damage, and those types of things. And I think what concerns me the most is the lack of empathy
Mm-hmm.
for the human population.
Mm-hmm.
It's not even the environmental side, right?
Mhm.
Because that's always been a thing.
Right.
It's always been difficult to try to convince people, not all people, but some people, that the environment matters.
Mhm.
But it's usually easier to convince someone to save a person than to save a tree, right? But it almost doesn't feel that way
Yeah.
to me.
Right.
And I think in the larger context of the political climate, that is very concerning, because I would have thought that with proposed rollbacks in regulations, ecological and environmental regulations, that more people would be up in arms about it,
Mhm.
rather than saying, "Yeah, I think that's a good idea." So when I read a disturbing headline that says this or this or this is proposed to happen, and I think there's no way that's going to happen. Everyone's going to freak out.
Mhm.
But then I don't see
No one's freaking out.
anyone freaking out
Out loud, at
So-
least.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. And so that's another thing I think about too, is at what point do you act?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And what does that action look like? And it's beyond talking about make sure that your tires are inflated to the appropriate pressure
Right.
and insulate your windows, right? It's beyond that. It's not
Yeah.
the simple changes. It's like, okay, we have major political, national, and international issues facing us. And I think that is at the forefront, really.
Yeah.
So I think some things have got to calm down politically before we can
Definitely.
really get our wits about us
Mhm.
to really face what we need
Right.
to face. And I think that currently bothers me more than just thinking about Arctic sea ice.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And not to minimize, but that's not. I guess that's not
But
where my focus
currently,
currently.
yeah.
Yes, and
Right.
I had said earlier to you in conversation that when we first started talking about doing an episode talking about climate anxiety, I felt less anxiety. I felt less climate anxiety at the time because it was prior to some of the
Right.
changes that have happened recently, and so I think that's what's brought that more to the forefront for me than
Mhm.
the things that used to keep me awake, which would be like chytridiomycosis or
Yeah.
other things,
Yeah.
rainforest, I don't know, whatever. But it's the attitude of people towards
Mhm.
the planet and each other
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
is the most anxiety inducing for me currently.
And I think a lot of that has to do, or at least for me personally, with like I didn't think we'd be going backwards like this. Like I mean, some of the problems that we've had environmentally, like like you said, they happen, and they're just things that would probably heal over time. But like now, it seems like we've jumped the gun backwards, and like we're having to kind of rewrite what we've already written, and
It
we
does
just didn't.
feel that way, doesn't
And
it?
it just that's what's made me the most
Yeah.
anxious, is and also to convince people that we are going backwards, which I'm like,
Mhm.
how do you not see
Yes,
that?
Mhm.
yes.
Like,
I also wonder if that is an age thing
it
too.
could
Mhm.
I
be.
mean, to some extent, because
Yeah.
I see what you see, even though I'm an older generation.
Mhm.
But and I do think that most young people see what you see.
Mhm.
I think the kids are all right. I talk to students, I talk to classes, and
Yeah.
they seem to get it. They
Mhm.
seem to know what's going on. But I'm not sure if some of it is generational. It gets lost in translation. I
Yeah.
don't know.
I don't know either. And it's interesting too, because this is another question I had that goes off of this, is like when you were saying, you had a different concern than, what maybe the average person does about things they hear in the headlines or whatnot. You have like a deeper concern of this. But do you think maybe that would change with like you being in the scientific community? Like, have you seen anything that you wish from that community specifically that we were more concerned about, or that you've observed amongst your colleagues that they've talked about expressing concerns on what they the political stressors, maybe just like in general of what's going on, versus like an average person thinking about saving the polar bears and whatnot. Like,
I think the concerns are the same, but the approach maybe is
oh,
different.
Mhm.
yeah,
Um, Maybe there's more data to analyze, sitting in your desk
Mhm.
folder or whatever than a regular quote regular person sitting at home reading
right,
about these issues. But the issues are the issues. There may be a little bit more technical understanding in the field, but I think everybody has the same anxiety, the
Mhm.
same fears. I think that there are a lot of people who are working in climate science who are they don't live in fear. They don't let their anxiety rule them, and they're out there trying to make solutions.
yeah,
And that's kind of what I was talking about earlier by like letting your fear fuel your action, right? Your
yeah.
call to action. Um, so I don't really know that it's different within the scientific community, other than maybe just more sort of generally widespread awareness,
Yeah.
maybe.
Mhm.
I just wondered because like from personal experience, when I go home and talk to people, like it seems like I have to teach them biology 101 or environmental 101 of like this is why we should care and not what. And so
Yeah, that's fair. I think I'm thinking a little bit too narrowly about the population. So I think I'm
okay.
not
Mhm.
I'm not thinking outside of like people I interact with on the
Yeah.
daily because
Mhm.
for that it's usually other college professors and college students.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit of a silo where everybody knows about the environment. But you're right because if I were to go have a conversation with like a cousin or my mom or somebody, I'm
Mhm.
going to have to start at baseline. And
Yes.
so yeah, I think there is an assumption that's a hidden problem in science that we've just uncovered. There's an assumption that people know more than they do.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And so that may be a dangerous direction for scientists to go in, right? Because we think, well, if you know, then why don't you care? And maybe
Mhm.
you really don't know. Or
Yeah.
maybe you just don't understand.
Mhm.
Yeah, maybe you've just never heard it. Or maybe you need biology 101 and because we do that every day, we think that is
Yeah.
common
Yeah.
knowledge, but it isn't.
Right.
And so I think that's probably I feel inspired now to take a step back and
Well, I was
think
just
about the way that I
yeah.
think science communication is a big a part of
Yes.
that, right?
Yes, that's been one of the most valuable courses I've ever taken in my life is
Really?
scientific communication because I think that somebody else might know this or this biological term or this concept and then I go and talk to them, my parents, somebody who's not in science at all, and they're like, "What?" I mean, even just saying, "I took comparative vertebrate anatomy and
Yeah.
physiology." They're like, "What does that mean?"
What are the words that you just
You
say?
just said blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
It makes no sense to them. So I think that that is so crucial because we have the knowledge here, and then there's just this big gap to fill in of how do we translate this
Yeah.
into just the average person or someone who is in history or the arts or whatever, so non-science,
Mhm.
non-STEM.
Exactly.
How do we translate this idea to them? And not to like other anybody or like outcast anyone, but it's like, we've got all this, we're all talking over here. It's a different language almost. So it's like
Yeah.
You're right.
we need
Yeah.
translation there.
That's very true.
Mm-hmm.
Very true.
I think that's honestly what inspired me and you to start like talking about this
Mhm.
and starting this
Mhm.
podcast too is like, you know, this is why I wanted that question because I didn't know if it was like maybe our age thing, like, our understanding, but also we've been through this major and whatnot, and like
Mhm.
versus you who've like studied it and been out and like applied it to real world, and like maybe you have more like insider scoop of other scientists like ideas of it. But again, like, having the communication, kind of that cross language almost of how to communicate it is really crucial, and why we want to make science digestible, and what I've
Yeah.
said in a lot. And I also think going off of scientific communication is like where you find your news resource is a big part in your climate anxiety, and especially with like people nowadays that just freak out with like one thing without actually reading the rest of the article.
Sure.
Like the amount of times my grandmother has sent me links to article headlines that I'm like off the bat, I'm like, oh my God, what is that? But then I go and read it and I'm like, I send her screenshots of paragraphs, a couple
Yeah.
of things down. I'm like, you probably should read this because it's not what you think it
Yeah.
is.
There's a lot of sensationalism and
Yeah.
people take something and run with it. And,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So can I ask you a question? Can I flip the script?
Yeah.
Sure.
So what do we do? How do we do that better as scientists? How do we communicate?
I
What's
think
the answer?
we just need to be mindful of jargon. I think just jargon in
Yeah.
general is just honestly one of the biggest barriers because, like I said, it's like a different language. I can't
Mhm.
sit there and say mycorrhizae and expect somebody else to know what
Yeah.
that is. So I think just having patience
Yes.
is number one, and just the ability to educate without being frustrated and the ability
Right.
to communicate without being frustrated
Yeah.
and having that patience because if I'm trying to explain a biological, I mean, we sat here and learned this in school. It's taken
Right.
years and semesters and hard work to
Money.
learn this
Yeah.
money
Yeah.
to learn all this stuff, and trying to just do that to someone for free in a 10-minute conversation.
Yeah.
It's a lot harder. There's a lot more pressure there to
Yeah.
just, okay, well, this is this and this is this. Like, why don't you understand this? But it's like you have to
Absolutely.
have that patience, and it might take many conversations to get to where you want to be, but at least explaining in short snippets like, okay, slow down, that's not what you think it is, or
Right.
this is what I talk about this is what I mean when I talk about this.
Mhm.
So I think it just takes a lot of patience, and I think honestly scientific communication as a course is almost like a language course, and
Mhm.
just knowing what to say when you're talking to other scientists versus
Mhm.
when you're talking to non-scientists, it can be so helpful because then we can translate ideas to each other and share
Yeah.
across the community, but then we can also translate those ideas to non-scientists and say, hey, this is what you can do, or this is what we found, what do y'all think of this, or just let people know what's been going on.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's what I really like about your mission here with this podcast too, is to
Mhm.
sort of make that information accessible.
Mhm.
But I was thinking about it earlier, and like how when you go looking for a podcast, what
Mhm.
doesn't matter what subject you're interested in,
Mhm.
almost always there's a sort of understood level of knowledge that
Mhm.
you kind of
Yeah.
come in with. So they're already talking about, well, this week's episode is going to be about mycorrhizae,
Yeah.
right? And then you're like, well, I don't even know what that is, so this is not the
Yeah.
podcast for me,
Yeah.
right? Whereas this one is really more like, let's get in here and talk about how does this affect us on the daily and
Mhm.
our own lives, and let's define some things for people. And I really love that. I think you guys have hit on something really cool with that.
Thanks.
So
Thank
I
you.
was gonna like tail on the end of what you were saying with
Mhm.
patience. I also think it's important to have balance too of like having solutions, well, problems and solutions, because a lot of people like when they do kind of have that fear or underlying anxiety of this topic, it's because all they hear are like the negative
yeah,
Mhm.
words, and rather than like that's why we're trying to like thread together climate problems and climate solutions that are easy. Because another thing is like relevance. You were kind of talking about that just a second ago of like, trying to make it kind of pertainable to their day and everything is like a lot of people just kind of throw environmental problems to the back of their brain because again they don't think it's really relevant to them, or maybe they don't think it's very convenient for them to care or to act upon it. So another thing that I think is a kind of way to go about this problem is to make it easier to understand by balancing those two things, but also by showing that a little small change can go a huge way, especially if all of us collectively do it and we're on the same side of history that way.
Absolutely.
But that's kind of like what and I like that you turn the thing like the
flipping
turn
the script
tables.
on
I'll
us.
interview you now.
Yeah, this is your podcast now. Whatever, you can take the turntable
literally.
mixing thing home
I
with
just
you.
think that you ladies are doing a good job of trying to do that, and so
Oh, thank you.
nice to hear a little bit about
Oh.
your,
I know,
your
so
take
it's
on
very
rewarding.
rewarding.
I know earlier we talked about, taking your fear and taking your anxiety and turning that into positive action. And I think that is something that we have to do at this point with anything. I mean, as someone who's personally experienced anxiety about a multitude of things, that's my fear and anxiety. That's my fuel. I'm like, okay, I'm going to class today. Like, I'm
Yeah.
going to class every single day. I don't care
Yeah.
if I feel like crap. I'm going to class and I'm
Yeah.
going to do this. I'm going to listen. I'm going to take notes. I'm going to change the world. And like, it sounds crazy, or it's like, oh, what does she think? Like that's weird. But I mean, that's what keeps me going. And that's just
Yeah.
what you have to do. I mean, if you just sit, I mean, sometimes I have to sit and cry about it because that's
Yeah.
just what you have to do.
Right.
But at the end of the day, you got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and say, okay, well, somebody has to do it, and
Yeah.
it's
We all
gonna
have
be me.
choices to make.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And you have to choose how you react to your anxiety or your
Yes.
fear and what you do with it.
Mhm.
And yeah, sometimes it's time to curl up in the corner and,
Yeah.
and freak out about it for
Yeah.
a little while. But then you dust yourself off
Yeah.
and you get up and you think, okay, what can I do next? And
Mhm.
for me, sometimes I think I'll vacillate in between thinking like this is not what I'm doing is making no difference at all.
Right.
And what am I doing here? I'm
Mhm.
just gonna knock it off, right? This is useless.
Yeah.
And then I think I try to talk myself up, and I'll
Yeah.
say things like, "Well, you don't know what kind of impact that made today. Maybe
Right.
maybe you spent the afternoon making plastic bag bracelets with kids. Let's
was
use
so
this
fun,
it
though.
is fun. It's
That was
very
so
fun.
fun.
We did it again this year. I should have had you
Aw.
come and help me. And I'm sitting there and it's hot
Yeah.
and it's a long day and I'm thinking like, is this even doing? But at the end of the day, I leave that fair and I think if 2 or 3 of these kids go home and talk to their brother or their mom or whatever about, oh, this is important and this is why it's important and we can take these trash bags and we can upcycle them and we can use use them for things and keep them out of the oceans and this and that. If that message trickles down because that kid came to that event where they made a plastic bag
Right.
bracelet, then that's a way to sort of see your action as impactful. Because I do think there's a lot of like, I am only one person.
Yes.
My actions are small. My ripples are near, right? But they're further, I think, than we think they are. So I try to think about that a lot too. When you feel like you're doing something little that isn't necessarily super impactful in that exact moment,
Yeah.
maybe you're missing some of the impacts. That
Yeah.
some of the messaging that you're sending out to kids who are younger than you, or lady neighbor across the street who's watching what you're doing, and you roll your recycle can to the end.
Yeah.
And then she's like, you know what, I should do that too. You never know, right?
Yeah.
So there are
Right.
impacts that you can't see from your actions, and I think that helps me to be optimistic and to continue to let the action overtake the anxiety.
Absolutely. And what's funny is like as you're talking about the individualistic like perspective, I have found so many people, especially as climate advocates, on the flip side saying that like individuality doesn't do anything. It's, going after the capitalistic problem or like the, big oil companies and all of the bigger problems, but I'm like that's kind of overshadowing the fact that we do still have power as a person, and that it maybe there are some problems that only can be solved by a larger scale, but at the same time, knowledge is power, and we have an impact, as you were just explaining your personal like journey in that, and like us talking about it here in the random campsite in Floyd County, like we have an impact from everywhere. It's just a matter of, do you want to go and do it? Do you want to actually, you know, put that pedal to the metal and go and, love what you're doing and want to tell somebody else about it. Like, I also hope that this helps people not feel shame and being a nerd about what they're in, because
Yeah.
when you love something enough, there's no problem just talking about it for
No.
hours,
Nerds are the coolest people that I know. Like when somebody is passionate and excited and loves what they know, just sit there and tell me about it all day.
Anytime somebody's super excited about something, it's
Yes.
kind of infectious, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So kind of to like in this like segment, we have climate resources in our website at all points, or like in our link tree as well, just in case that you don't have the luxury of finding people like we have here that you can just talk about and have that common ground of like, oh, I felt that way. I'm glad that I'm not the only person. But I wanted to add an additional resource and say, do you have anything for our audience to maybe go to, or like ways that they can find kind of therapy within like on their own without having to go and pay for it, or like just resources they can use?
Sure, yeah. So, I brought a book. I don't know these
Hey.
people, everyone. It's called All
Not
We Can
sponsored.
Save. The subtitle is Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis, and it's a compilation. And I
Okay.
bought it when I was first teaching conservation biology because I was looking for inspiration. I was looking for ideas, ways to say, here are things you can do,
Yeah.
because it's a tough subject to
Yeah.
teach
Mm-hmm.
when you're there going, okay, here are all the here are all
Yeah.
the problems that we have caused, and here are the challenges that we face in trying to fix them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was looking for some sort of positivity, right?
Yeah.
And I really like this book because, again, I don't know these women, but
Not
the
sponsored.
editors are Ayana Elizabeth Johnson and Catherine K. Wilkinson, both PhDs, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. And Dr. Wilkinson actually has a podcast, and it's
Oh.
called A Matter of Degrees. And that podcast goes into talking with individuals who work in climate
Mm-hmm.
and what they're working on and what
Mhm.
their solutions are. And so
Mhm.
it's very hopeful. But the book itself is a compilation of writing. Some of them are essays, some of them are poems, some of them are just quotes. But it's just voices, and they're all feminine voices, which I also
Oh,
think is really cool,
Love that.
right? Because it's coming from uh, and I'm going to speak in generalizations,
Yeah.
right? But we're as females, we tend to be very in touch with emotions,
yeah.
and we tend to think a lot more. I guess about this is not slamming guys, so don't take it as that. But the empathy, the sort of
Yeah.
connectedness to each other, and caring for each other, that sort of caring nature, I think, comes through in the love for planet,
Mm-hmm.
right? In
Right.
the same way
Mhm.
that sort of motherly love comes across for other things that we approach. But so it's a really good book. It's also tied to a website called All We Can Save Project.
Yes, we've talked
Yes.
about
And
this.
on that website, there are
Okay.
tons of resources. There are just like everyday suggestions, things
Mhm.
that you can do. Eat a plant-based diet. Here's how that helps. Those types of
Yeah.
like little things that you can do. But there are also resources that you can do where you can create what's called a circle, and you join up with people. It's almost like a book club, but you're talking with other people, and I have not done a circle yet. I have to admit yet myself, but I
Okay,
think it's
we
a
should do a
we should do a
circle.
circle, and we'll
Hello.
figure out what's entailed. But the idea behind it is getting people together who are at different places
Yeah.
in their climate journey or their educational journey or whatever, and discussing these things from the places that you come from, and using the readings in the book as sort of a springboard, which
Yeah.
I really like that idea
That's
too. So
really
I
cool.
think that I don't have a whole list of curated resources to say go here, but this one is a kind of does that for you.
Yeah.
So if
Huh.
you start there at that website and just kind of click around and see what all they have to offer, there's a lot, and every time I go on the website, there's more stuff. So again,
That's good to
if you Ayana, Catherine, if y'all want to be friends,
Yeah. Hit
I'm
us up.
down. It sounds like I know them, but I'm sure they're delightful. But I really like their work, so that would be a good place to start. I think.
Yeah, I like that. It's easy,
Yeah.
and it's not like, because another thing is like I think people are kind of discouraged from finding resources because there's so many that they
Mm-hmm.
don't like want to have to find niche ones. This is another thing that we try to do here is like we always put our resources down below, and we'll do that for this as well, and like so you can just click, just one little click, but like that's good to know that there's one thing that has a bunch of things.
Yeah.
So you're kind
Yeah.
of
I like there's a quote in here I was going to read. Check
sure,
it out
yeah,
if
yeah.
you want. But this
Oh
is
yeah.
this is kind of a thought for closing.
Okay.
Okay, so this is a quote from a woman named Erin Meezan. I don't know who she is. It doesn't say like what's her who she where she comes from, but
Mhm.
I like the quote. we need business goals. This is also speaking to the corporate responsibility
Yeah.
type thing. We need business goals that are bigger than doing less harm or emitting less carbon. The goal has to be what the planet needs, a climate fit for life,
Oh, wow.
not humans, life,
Life.
right? And this is my favorite part. And we need optimism and courage to get there, maybe more than we need science or data. And the thing I like so much about that is, like we were saying earlier, we have the data.
We have all that.
We see it. It's
Yeah.
obvious. It's happening. We are seeing the daily ramifications
Mhm.
of a changing climate.
Right.
Yes.
What we need is optimism and courage,
Wow.
because that's how
Absolutely.
problems are solved, right?
Yes,
We know the
absolutely.
problem. You
We
have
know
you
it.
have delineated the problem for us.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Now we need to solve those problems, and we can. Humans are very good, like
Oh,
we've been
yes.
talking about, at problem solving. But it does take courage, because there are huge giants at play.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. And that is very true. I
Mhm.
understand what you're talking about, where climate advocates come out and say, well, there's really nothing you can do as an individual, because we got to go after the corporations. And there is some truth to that.
Mhm.
But you do have to go after the corporations.
Yeah,
You can't just
someone
sit at
has to.
home and say,
Right.
well, I can't, everything, it doesn't matter what I do, because it does. First of all, it does. All of your little actions add up to bigger actions. And like you said, if everybody did it, it would be a huge deal, right?
Yep.
If everybody was using efficient, your air conditioning isn't running harder than it needs to because your windows aren't sealed right. Like,
Yeah.
maybe a $5, $10 tube of caulk at Home Depot can help that problem, right? If
Mhm.
everybody did that, that's going to make a big dent.
Mhm.
If everybody drove a hybrid vehicle, if everybody
Yeah.
did. So your individual choices do absolutely matter,
Mhm.
but the individual actions that you can take that matter, I think, the most are probably policy related.
Yeah.
Right? And everybody said, write a letter to your congressman, let your voice be heard. But that's how it happens.
Exactly.
And you can argue that there is big money in lobby and that you can't compete with that. But you know what? You can walk into
Yes.
the state house.
We did it.
We did.
We
and
did that.
You can talk with your representatives. And
Yeah.
that was very eye opening that day, I felt like,
Yes,
for me,
it
because it
was.
was like, oh, this is what. you
It's that
can
easy
actually-
too.
it is
Like I
that
didn't
easy.
know you can
Yeah.
just walk into the Capitol.
Yeah, there
I
are
mean,
days where they're taking
Yeah.
conversations with regular
Right.
people who
Yeah.
just walk in the door and say,
Mhm.
I want you to know
Mhm.
that I feel very strongly about this bill for this purpose.
Right.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the push they needed that day.
Yeah.
We don't know.
Yeah. I mean, just be
so-
that little gnat that's
Yeah.
constantly buzzing and buzzing and buzzing. Because if there's
Absolutely.
nothing at all, then there's no out of sight, out of mind. There's
Yes.
nothing
Yeah.
on their radar. But if they're like, okay, 50 people have said this to me in the last 2 weeks, maybe that's
Yeah.
something I should be thinking about.
Yeah, and letter
Yes.
writing is real, and
Yes, it
emails are
is.
real, and they
Yeah.
really do. I mean, maybe your congressman is not reading every single email, but his secretary
there.
is, or someone, and
Someone knows they're
this
there.
information is coming in, and they are
Mhm.
seeing it, and
Mhm.
I mean that's powerful. So
Mhm.
your vote is the most important thing. Your
Yes.
vote, your voice is more important.
Absolutely.
Now, I'm not going to say don't recycle, because you should, right? I'm not going to say don't try to be efficient, and I fully support anything you can do to decrease your own impact and your own carbon footprint. But yeah, I think collectively those small changes make a difference.
Mhm.
But yes, there are corporate responsibility and political responsibility, and those go hand in hand.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And so that's, I think, a responsibility that we need to take. And I know it's not for me. I speak for myself as well as others when I say it's not for everyone, right? Like politics and government
yeah.
and understanding how laws are made. It's wah wah. I'm a biologist because I like to look at crazy weird stuff outside and
Yeah.
look at, snails crawling around on trees
Oh
and
yeah.
glowing orange mushrooms and things like that. But there are people who do work in policy, and we can interact with those people, and that's really important. So I think
Absolutely.
yeah.
That was a great endpoint though.
Yeah.
Like,
Well,
just
thanks.
amazing.
I love that quote. I was
Yeah.
very excited to share it with you guys, because I think that is we have the courage to make the change.
Yeah.
And the optimism,
Mhm.
Yep.
right? To believe that we can make a difference.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
And that there's a reason to, that there's a good reason to, and that it does matter. It matters for our children, our children's children,
Mhm.
and life on the planet. Climate
Mhm.
fit for life, right?
There
Absolutely.
we go.
That's the goal.
I love it. Well, thank you again for being on our
Yes.
podcast
Thank you.
and just talking to us about this. I feel like it's so reassuring to talk to somebody older that has the same insight, even if it's because you're in this profession and you just love this stuff. Like that, regardless of that, like it's reassuring that, we don't feel like the planet's in our hands only.
Right.
Because I feel like that's another thing people are like, oh, the younger generation will save.
Yeah.
But like this has been really,
Yeah, no,
It's a collective
we've
effort.
got to be working on things currently.
Yeah.
Right? Middle career, late career, early career, it doesn't
Right.
matter. We've all got to be working on it. It's not for you guys to save. It's
Yeah.
for, Riley's generation to
Yeah.
save.
Yeah.
behind the camera.
She's 12, so yeah, we're counting on you, girl, but it's
Yeah.
not all your responsibility. No, I think that's really important. And again, it's a real pleasure to work with students of environmental science because I get to see who is coming up and I get to see that you do care.
Yeah.
I really do feel reassured when I spend time with college students because you get it and you see
Heck
and,
yeah.
And,
Heck
and
yeah.
it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. Optimism and courage.
It's gonna be all
absolutely will
right.
be all right.
With that being said, thank you again for joining us on Green Thread, and hopefully this inspired you to take some climate action, call your representatives, talk to somebody, no shame in getting help and like figuring out your own thoughts. We have figured out our own thoughts
Yeah.
in weird ways. So yeah, hope we'll tune in to you next time and give you some more resources.
See you next time.